Well, thank you all for being here tonight. I have been really looking forward to tonight. I'm excited about tonight because I believe that all politics are spiritual, and I believe all spirituality is political. And to meld them together is quite the task and very difficult to do. And tonight's speaker is someone who has shown again and again and again the capacity to walk in both of those worlds, understanding how the political dynamics of world and global economy work, understanding the cry of the earth, and also understanding that Christian theology is not a cult or a sect or a against culture lifestyle, but that the Christian theology is something that wants to engage the world and again try to make it a little better place, creating better people for a better world. And Cynthia Moe-Lobeda is our guest tonight, and she teaches at Seattle University, and she's pretty brilliant, and that's my only introduction because she will do the rest. So let's welcome her.
Well, that was a lovely introduction. I'm happy to be considered brilliant. No. I was going to say that I've spoken all over the place in many different continents, and I'm never nervous. But tonight I am because my son's in the audience for the first time, and because I know you guys, so it scares me to death. But I really want to begin by by just offering my deep respect for the people in this room. You have given years, some of you decades, of courage and tenacity and spirit and wisdom to the work of building a more just and compassionate world. And you have inspired and encouraged me and many others. And for that, I offer profound respect. Saying that also makes my task a little more difficult, because inspire and encourage are, in many traditions, including Christian traditions, works that are associated with the Spirit, which means that if you have been inspiring and encouraging, that you are living in some way a very embodied spirituality, whether you know it or not. So it makes me wonder what I have to say to you about a deep spirituality. But what I decided to do was share with you a reality that I find haunting, and then share with you a few of the paths that I have found to make a way through that reality. First, though, I thought it might make sense just to take a minute to look at that word, spirituality. It has been used so often. Well, it has been used to mean so many different things. Is anyone familiar with the name Sittler, Joseph Sittler? Kind of a renegade Lutheran theologian. He wrote once, "The word spirituality is sort of like an old Barnum and Bailey circus tent. It covers so many various kinds of animals, events, acts, and episodes that it is hard to pin down." And I think that he's right in that. The point, though, is important, because what is meant by that word can have life and death consequences. To illustrate, the word has often been misused in Christian traditions and other religious traditions to mean a kind of separation from the world, to signify removal from the material realities of bodily life, of political, economic engagement in the world. That idea of spirituality is not grounded in Scripture. It's grounded in Neoplatonic philosophy that influenced the developing Christian traditions, and a philosophy that had, as you probably know, material reality down here and God up here and spirit up here with God. So to be spiritual meant divorcing yourself from the material realities of life. Spirituality has also been misused to imply a kind of privatized relationship between me and God. I would suggest that I don't use the term to mean either of those two things. Neither does most of Christian tradition, although people often associate those understandings of spirituality with Christianity. They're extremely abiblical. They're not biblical. A more biblical notion of, well, the Apostle Paul. I think that Christianity sometimes gets that separation of body and spirit from the reading of the Apostle Paul that warns us to not live in the body, in the flesh, but live in the spirit. And those two words, sarx and pneuma, really don't mean body and spirit. They mean the difference between life in the Spirit of God and life not in the Spirit of God. So I want to just begin by suggesting that spirituality doesn't have anything to do with living in the Spirit rather than the world. I think of spirituality as the way in which people seek to hear and respond to that great mystery that Christian and Jewish and Muslim traditions call God, so inadequately call God because it is so much more. To listen to that voice singing within us and singing in the world around us, and then to respond to that. To me, that is a way of thinking about spirituality. That would suggest then that the spiritual quest and the quest for justice are not two different quests, but are one and the same, both being responses to the call of God upon our lives. Well, that said, just to put aside a misnotion of spirituality, what I'd like to do is take a minute just to acknowledge the moment in which we live, and then suggest a framework for a spirituality of resistance. And then it's a framework that has 3 parts, and then I'd like to spend some time with the third of those parts. So that's the 20 minutes. So we'll work on that 20 minutes thing. You are as aware as am I that we live in a haunting moment of history. The power of social structural evil is unprecedented, partly because human power is so advanced, and partly because, and more importantly, human power is so concentrated in so few hands. Humankind, I would suggest, hovers on a kind of precipice at this moment. Corporate and finance-driven globalization, the economy that is shaping the terms of life for all creatures on Earth, is hurtling us towards an economic and ecological disaster that we are all fairly aware of and, as I said, haunted by. The ecological part of that disaster is pretty obvious. Our young and dangerous species has become a threat to Earth's life-generating capacities. Is anyone familiar with the Warning to Humanity that was written in 1992 by about 1,600 of the world's senior scientists? You read that? It's called A Warning to Humanity. You can Google it. It struck me because it's so old. It's 20 years old. 1,600 senior scientists, including a majority of the living Nobel laureates, and they wrote, "Human beings and the natural world are in a collision course that may so alter the living world that it will be unable to sustain life in the manner that we know." End quote. That was 20 years ago. So the economic aspect of the crisis is no less familiar to the people here. Never has the world's wealth been so heavily concentrated in such a minute minority of people. And as you know, that concentration of wealth for many means brutal poverty. I think the implications of that were spoken to me in a way that hit home more than any other in a meeting with Father John Sobrino. Do you know that name? Jesuit priest in El Salvador, one of the members of the community of martyred Jesuit priests. And a small group of people was meeting with him, a group of people in a delegation that I had helped to lead to El Salvador and Guatemala. And he said, in El Salvador, poverty means death. And people here are not poor by chance. They're poor because of the economic systems that make you rich. And That, I think, is really the most disturbing and soul-shattering aspect of the economic crisis in which we find ourselves, to me. Obviously, if we're hovering on a precipice, one side of it, the continuation of unchecked corporate and finance power, is not so pretty. The other side of it, however, is the potential before us. And that is moving toward that vision that people here gathered have. We have it in different forms, but it's a vision of a world in which all people have the necessities for life with dignity, and Earth's ecosystems can flourish. There's an old Chinese proverb that says, if we don't change direction, we will end up where we are headed. And I think there's some truth to that, obviously. The question before us, and a question that is always before my mind, is what kind of spirituality, what form of spirituality enables us to be moving toward that change direction? What spirituality enables that reverse in direction? What will lead us toward, in Reverend Dr. Martin Luther King's words, the blessed community? What is a spirituality capable of guiding us in our times? To me, it has to be a spirituality that affirms and honors the mixture of rage within me and the mixture of profound gratitude. I feel like I wake up in the morning and soon am furious at what is happening to people on the planet, and at the same time am overwhelmed by the beauty that is just pulsing around us in people and in the world, and just the glittering magnificence around us. So a spirituality, I believe, has to be able to hold both of those and name them as important in the work of love. It has seemed to me as time has gone on that one of the potent factors that works against a radical change in direction can be a sense of despair or hopelessness. And I think that that is often very subtle, unspoken, tacit, not right out there. I think it can be despair that despite our efforts, despite the way we throw our lives into justice making, maybe things just won't change. I think it can also be a kind of despair that comes with knowing that much as we struggle against structural evil, we're still wound up in it. That the clothes on our bodies and the food, the ingredients in the cookies in the kitchen and the roads that we drove on and the bikes that we may have ridden are dependent upon petroleum all over the place and dependent upon exploited labor. We're wound up in it all. And to me, that is also something that can eat away and build a kind of subtle powerlessness. So I think that a spirituality of resistance must fortify us against despair and hopelessness of both of those kinds, and yet can't lure us into ignoring the realities that we are so aware of. It's tempting to be lured into a kind of privatized morality where I'll be as good as I can. I'll love my neighbor in terms of my students and my friends and maybe the people in my city, but quit attending to the social systems that are beating people down. So a spirituality can't do that. I'd like to suggest a spirituality that has what I will call three-eyed vision. And by three-eyed vision, I mean a kind of code word. And that would be a code word for seeing always three things at one time. And like seeing through three lenses. I know that there are only two in most of our faces, but seeing through three lenses. And the first of those is the lens that does see what is going on. In Dietrich Bonhoeffer's words, the vision that sees systemic evil where it parades as good. that refuses to not see, to ever more clearly analyze and realize what's going on. For instance, one of the things that's become important for me to see that I hadn't seen a couple of years ago was the extent to which white privilege and white racism are fundamental to the earth crisis. The climate refugees, the people that are dying, are not white. The descendants of the tribes of Europe are much more protected than the descendants of the tribes of Asia and Africa. So that reality needs to be known and named. So an eye for what's going on, seeing ever more clearly, astutely. But I've often warned my students, in fact, I always warn them, don't see what's going on. Don't. It'll burn you, it'll lay you flat, it'll wipe you out. It did me once, when I was a young person, actually. I actually wasn't going to tell this story, but I guess I will tell this story. When I was about 14, I saw a film that I think was called, it was in my Luther League group. Luther League is like the Wesley Club, I suppose. It's a youth group of Lutherans. And there was a film called, I think it was called Guess Who's Coming to Breakfast. And it was, has anyone seen that film? I'm not sure that was the name of it. But it showed the impact of U.S. Corporate exploitation in the Dominican Republic. The blood that covers our breakfast cereal, our sugar, our orange juice, etc. And it just laid me flat to think that my life was that wrapped up in evil. And so I worked on organizing and young world development and hunger hikes and teach-ins and et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. But the long and short of it was I think I became hopeless. And for about 4 years lived that hopelessness. And it was because I was seeing what is, and that's it. So to me, it's a moral imperative not to ask people to see what is, unless we also see two other things. And one of those is what could be. These are terms of my discipline is Christian ethics, so we talk about the difference between what is and what could be. But what could be, that is the incredible, the magnificent alternatives that are in the making. The people on this continent, but the world over, that are committed in everyday practices, public policies, vastly new principles, economic theories and ideas, and ways of living them out in public policy and in everyday life that are building a world that is not grounded in concentrated power, but that is far more shared power and democratic. And we here in the U.S. are at a disadvantage because we don't see those movements as clearly. I was at a meeting in Geneva it was a UN-based meeting with the World Council of Churches. It was the 10th meeting in anniversary of the World Summit on Social Development. The ground was covered with little booths of more than 1,000 groups and organizations from around the world that were defiantly, vehemently, joyfully proclaiming that they would bring an end to poverty. And so that kind of vision, I think we need to always hold in mind and work to bring it into the public discourse. Our lives are involved in those groups, but it's easy not to see that what we're doing is connected to what people are doing all over the globe. I was just in India for last year for about a month working on eco-justice issues. And the fierce determination of social movements just kind of put me to shame. And I think that we must watch always that alternatives are in the making. Yeah. I think there's a third thing. So the first is what is, the second is what could be. The third, I believe, is always seeing the power and the presence of God coursing throughout all of creation, bringing us, luring us, calling us from the way things are to the way things ought be. I believe that a spirituality for our time needs to look at all of those. These sessions in this Common Good Cafe have focused, I would say, on the first and the second, maybe especially on the first, but also on the second. So I'd like to spend a little time focusing on the third. And by that I mean I'd like to just talk with you about what on earth it would mean. Now I ask myself this: what would it mean if I took seriously, really seriously, the idea that God, and however you, for some people that word doesn't work. It's a word that I don't particularly like anymore because it carries profound baggage. I mean, to some people it's a white guy in the sky, and we know it's not a white guy in the sky, but it still sometimes means a kind of limitedness that is not the reality of the magnificent, unnameable mystery of intimate life and love that pervades the universe. So I don't know the right word to use for it. I do know that, well, we could talk more about that. I don't want to imply a negating of a personalized sense of God, because I think that great reality manifests itself in many ways, and one of those is in a personalized form of God. So there's a lot more to talk about there, but I don't want to put down that idea, because I wouldn't put it down. But the point is, what would it mean to seriously think that this force of life, the source of all that is, known in our limited human language perhaps most profoundly as love, justice-making, self-honoring, earth-honoring love, what would it mean to believe that that force was, in Luther's terms, flowing and pouring through all things? It's easy to say. I wonder what it would really mean to take it seriously. And as I have sort of been teaching myself to take it seriously over time, there are three things that have appeared to me. And one of them is that if I hold that in my heart as true, it has an influence on my understanding of who I am. What I would say, what we would call moral anthropology, the sense of who we are as human beings. And I would suggest a spirituality that holds a kind of paradoxical moral anthropology. That yes, when we are honest and see what is, we know that we're wrapped up in, we're the beneficiaries of empire. We're wrapped up in a kind of structural evil that began at least 500 years ago when Europe started taking over the world. So we are caught up in that. Most of us here are beneficiaries of white privilege, which is a massive reality. But the paradoxical moral anthropology is that we are also someone else, that we were created and called into being for a purpose, that we were called into being to be friends of God, but more specifically to receive and trust a kind of unbelievable love, a life-affirming, life-saving love, and then to live it into the world. That's a sense of who we are, that I have a life work, and that is to bask in, to trust, to receive that love, and then to breathe it out. And we know that love, as we learn it, at least from a biblical sense, is profoundly seeking of justice. Love didn't just bind up the wounds of the slaves, it tried to end slavery. So when I am somewhat overwhelmed by the reality of being implicated in empire and other forms of injustice, it helps me to know that I am also this creature created to live into right relationships, and moreover empowered by that. I claim that God doesn't call us to anything that God doesn't empower us to. Although with great mistakes, I'm very much a realist and Lutheran enough to know that we do it fallibly all the time. I really like the image of, Luther has this image of that we're rusty tools, and I think we're very rusty. But my point there is, knowing that sense of who I am is a source of hope. I think there's a second implication of believing that the source of all that is flowing through us. And that has to do with our power, our moral power to resist systemic domination, to seek the good despite the risks involved. From the time of the ancient Hebrews, Jewish people and Christian people have claimed that there is a power breathed into us, and it's the power of the living God called Spirit, that we know by this name of Spirit. The ancient Hebrews believed that this power reached down into their lives. The word for spirit in the Hebrew text is ruach, R-U-A-C-H, and it was not a disembodied kind of a thing. The Spirit beckoned people, and not only beckoned but empowered them to risk everything in order to do the will of the living God that was seeking justice. I'll say parenthetically here, when I say filled with the Spirit of the living God, an image that comes to my mind there is the image of what you would do. Has anyone done the exercise of taking a Bible and snipping out all the places where it talks about justice or serving the well-being of the underside of history? Has anyone done that? I know, so it's like a Bible in tatters. So to be filled with the Spirit of this God is to be filled with something that is going out there to seek what is right. I spent some time studying the Spirit in the Hebrew texts in the New Testament. Ruach in the Hebrew translates to pneuma in the Greek, which is slightly more domesticated than ruach. And then that translates into the Latin as espiritu, at which point it becomes much more ethereal and much more domesticated. So you can see it we could talk a lot about this, a progression of us sort of getting away from the world-shaking impact of the Spirit, and there's good reason to come back to that. But what I also noticed in reading the texts is something that you all are aware of probably long before I was, and that's that heeding the bidding of the Spirit can be very dangerous. Daniel Berrigan once said, y'all know that saying, if you want to follow Jesus, you better look good on wood. It's kind of a reality that we all have sensed at one time or another in different ways. I think that reality, though, leads us to see something about the role of the Spirit in our moral power. And I want to share with you the idea that the Spirit of the living God brings courage. I was also studying Martin Luther, and it was during a time actually when the WTO things were going on here, and I noticed that Luther's economic ethics sounded the same as the WTO protesters, and so I decided to test that out, and I wrote down some of what he said, critiquing the liberal market economy of his day and the WTO protesters, and then I was giving a talk in South Dakota, and I asked people to vote on what they thought was who, and they couldn't tell the difference. So I remembered he was a bad guy in some ways, but he was an incredible guy in some other ways, and he lived out some courage in defying systemic domination. And one of the things that I treasured in what I read in him about the Spirit was this. He says, the most powerful courage known to humankind is generated by the Spirit living in the faithful. The Spirit brings into its human abode true courage, boldness of heart. The Hebrew word for spirit, he goes on to say, might well be rendered bold, undaunted courage. That bold, dauntless courage will not be terrified by poverty, shame, sin, or the devil or death, but is confident that nothing can harm us. That empowering courage is more powerful than anything on earth, according to Luther. It lives in us. It bears recalling that it makes a home in us. And then very briefly, I want to mention a third way that I think the power of the living God indwelling all things can be a source for us of hope. And that is shifting our mentalities, the mentality of the West, into taking seriously the idea that the things of earth, the other than human things of earth, also bear the divine. That God is indeed living in all things, even the tiniest leaf, to quote one ancient theologian. If earth embodies God, and if the Word of God, wherever it comes to change the world, then that power is present in the things of this earth in ways that we have not learned to see or to receive. What would it mean if we did take seriously the mountains of biblical texts in which God calls upon the winds and the mountains and the seas, God indwells them, God works with them? What if we took seriously the ancient claim, and it is an ancient faith claim throughout the centuries of Christian history, that the earth's creatures and elements bear God, our abode of God? I'm not sure what all it would mean. One thing that I think about is that means that when we crucify the earth, we're crucifying Christ again, and how might that impact the way we treat the earth? Another thing I think it means is that some of the moral wisdom and the spiritual wisdom that we need in order to not fall over that precipice but go the other direction may be offered to us from a source that we are not well equipped to hear from, and that we are invited to hear from, and that is the earth itself. What can we learn about moral courage for resistance? What can we learn about moral courage for life-giving life from the things of the earth? I was talking about this with some scientists at one point, and someone talked with me about, some of you probably know the exacts of this better than I do, but there's a kind of tree, is it the ash tree? Where it lives, maybe it lives down here by the water and way up the hill, like way miles away also. And when the drought comes, the roots of the ash tree down by the water pass the water on up to the ash tree way up there miles away. It might not be the ash tray, and I might be getting ash tree, and I might be getting the details wrong, but it's just a way of thinking about what might we learn if we learned to hear the voices other than the human. You're standing up and I'm almost done. That was really good timing, Rich. So anyway, these are a few, what I would say, wells that I drink from. And they are wells that offer me what Sally McFay, you know the name Sally McFay? Eco-theologian Sally McFay says is hope. Hope that our efforts on behalf of our beloved world are not ours alone, but that the source and power of life in the universe is working in and through us for the well-being of all of creation, including our tiny part in it. So we'll end with her words. Yeah. Jeez, thank you for an easy question. Oh my God. Right, give me a little more of that caffeine. First, it's a really, really good question. I think it's a dangerous word because it too can be misused. I think it can be misused in a couple of ways. If we say something is evil and other things are good, I actually don't hold that to be true. I think that good and evil in human things are always mixed up. I think nothing is purely evil, that one of the demands of using religion in the public discourse is not to demonize anything as evil or anything as totally good. And I think it's also can be a dangerous word from a feminist perspective if evil is seen as something out there. If evil is seen as out there and therefore needing somehow superhuman power to deal with, rather than evil being a part of life and that our human power can address it. But That said, evil to me, I use evil to signify, let me see, I use evil. It's a very important question because I'm just finishing a book in 1 week called Resisting Systemic Evil. Love as Economic Ecological Vocation. So it's a little befounding that I can't say what I mean by evil. Well, theologically, evil has meant different things. I mean, some would say evil is absence of the good. Augustine would say evil is absence of the good. I tend to think otherwise. It's a question debated all throughout the theological history. I do tend to think there is a reality of evil which may be created by brokenness. There is a reality, let me put it this way, there is a reality of humans countering absolutely the ways of God, the love of God, the right, the good. And there is the reality of when that is not just individual, but wound together, when it's systemic, when things bad are happening, not because any individuals are doing them bad, but that things horrible are happening because of our collective lives together, that there needs to be a word for that horrible wrongness. And I guess I put evil to that word. I mean, I put the word evil to that, a way of signifying, and the issue of, is there a force? Maybe there is a force of evil that inhabits human life, and that part of the call to love neighbor as self and to do that in ways that seek justice is to always stand alert to that force of evil, but never to equate it with any person or anything. I feel that fiercely. I don't know if that helps a little bit. Yeah, okay. Yes. I think that one way, I'll respond to that in terms of how I work with my students, because many of them are suspicious of words like God or pray or Christian or whatever. And to me, what's really important is naming from the beginning that those words affiliated with a religious tradition, in this case Christianity, that to me it's a matter of naming from the beginning that Christianity has done horrible wrong. To talk about the disgraced and the graced aspects of the tradition. I find it really opens people's minds to think that I'm going to acknowledge that Christianity has been one of the forces of evil on earth, but that doesn't in any way lessen the fact that it also is seeking to communicate and reveal the living God. So I guess saying out front the way, when someone asks me, I remember all these times on the soccer field when I'd be watching my kids' soccer game and someone would say, "Oh, what do you do?" or "Where have you been?" And I'll say, "I'm a theologian," and they'll say, "Oh my God, Christianity." And so I instantly tell them I'm a Christian, and then I say something about what it means to me. So I guess to just cut through the false uses of those words right from the beginning can be useful. Yes. My response would be, I do not attribute everything we do to the power of God working in us. I would say that the ways in which we as human beings or as a particular culture within humankind are doing destructive things to other people on the earth is not the leading of God. I would say that is our failure to hear and follow the leading of God. So to me, to have an eye for the power and presence of God is to have the ear, the eye for the leading that would take us away from those death-dealing, death-oriented ways. Now, I'm really aware that it's really dangerous to claim that I'm going to listen to what God tells me to do. Because the worst things on earth have been done because people claim the power of the Spirit of God is within me and telling me to go and burn other people at the stake. So we know that to be true. So I don't say at all blithely that we ought to heed the beckoning of the Spirit. I think that would be horribly romanticizing to suggest that. However, there's a paradox, because claiming to be acting on the will of God, according to the will of God, okay, on the one hand, it does things like make people fly airplanes into the Twin Towers, and it makes people do things like wage warfare against Iraq because you say they flew things. This will of God is a very ridiculous claim. On the other hand, we would be nuts not to. I mean, if we believe in something beyond, that transcends singularly the material, that is a power of good, however you want to say it, then we'd be nuts not to try to hear it. So the question becomes, what are our tools and our criteria for discerning what is the beckoning of God and what isn't? That becomes of tremendous import. And it becomes of import when we think about how we read Scripture. You know, of all the places that people misread the beckoning of God, it's through the Bible. You know, people kill people because of what the Bible tells them to do. So developing our ability to discern, to read the Scripture and read the tradition and read the signs of the times discerningly, is of paramount importance if we're going to claim that we listen to the power of God. And we could talk about what those criteria are and what that, we could talk about that right now. I'm not going to go there immediately unless there's a desire from people to go there. Yeah. So what makes it happen for you is recognizing what is and recognizing what you would want to be and the call to move that way. Is that what you're saying? And that, from my perspective, that's what we call moral agency. The power to move from the way things are toward the way things ought be. That is moral agency. And what feeds our moral agency is a question of utmost import today, especially for people like the people in this room who have dared to see a lot of what is. You know, most people in our society, I will say, run. I mean, we all do. We all run from really recognizing what is going on. We run fiercely. But the people here gathered have dared to see a lot more than is probably normative. So when we've seen some of the brutality of the everyday life that we live, and we have a vision, you know, a vision that's a promise of a different kind of a world where some people don't accumulate at the cost of others, where all have life and have it life abundantly. When we see that, then how we move from here to here, and what feeds that capacity, what keeps us from running away from seeing, or what keeps us from believing this isn't possible, or what keeps us from getting stomped in the middle is the question. What feeds our moral agency is the question. To me, it's fed in part by the things that I just said. I find it's fed in part by believing we're not alone, that we are not alone, that something that we, in our incredibly limited capacities to speak reality, that we just give the name God, but that is an amazing, pulsating source of profound goodness and beauty and life, and it creates the universe, and it is creating. And the promise, to me, the promise of the resurrection doesn't have to do with my life after death. The promise of the resurrection, I guess we're supposed to stop.
Don't tell them.
that we're not alone is really important to me. And the promise of the resurrection came to me when I told you I was in such despair as a young person. Well, I finally realized I needed to talk to somebody who had seen as much structural evil as I had gotten existed in terms of the military-industrial complex, and who had not given up hope. And so I had the inspiration to go and see a Lutheran pastor, believe it or not, named John Nelson, who was an active person in the resistance to the Trident submarines, and had adopted 13 kids, and they're all special needs kids. And actually his mother, who was like 85, was out there. You know about her story? She was out there resisting the submarines when the Coast Guard came, and the Coast Guard's going to squirt her out of her boat, and she waves their little flag and says, "Not in my America, you won't." And they didn't squirt her. But anyway, I said, "John, how do you keep up your hope?" And he said, I don't remember if these are his words, but this was what I took away. He said, "Cindy, I know the end of the story." And what that said to me is that the promise of the resurrection is that ultimately, in some way we cannot fathom because we've read the news, that the world is in God's hands, and that life will reign, and that our job is to have that power of the life force working in us towards that. And so I'm giving up, even though I don't get it, how possibly life could reign, because I've been reading about global warming. I believe it, and it's because of the story of the resurrection. And so that's part of what enables me to keep moving. Martin Luther King Jr. said it beautifully. He said, "The arc of the universe is toward justice," which is another way of saying in secular terms what he knew theologically, and that all we're supposed to do is try to get ourselves into that arc and go that way.
Thank you. Thank you.